Goedemiddag allemaal, good afternoon, Maweli. My naam is Nicola Smit, ek is die dekaan van die Fakulteit Regsgeleerheid en dis 'n voorreg vir my om u te verwelkom hier in die Ou Hoof Gebou en ook almal wat virtueel bywoon. Because of the presence of our international guests and the diverse audience we have online, most of the formal proceedings will be in English. However, I do want to welcome the De Waal family first before we commence. Almarie en Greta, ons is so bevoorreg dat julle by ons aansluit vandag. Saam met Almarie en Greta is Marius se susters Marike en Corneille ook hier. Ook Marius se pa, meneer Japie Joubert. Baie welkom. Dit is vir ons werklik maar 'n voorreg om hierdie gedenkgeleentheid saam met u te kan beleef. It was with great sadness that the Faculty of Law heard the news that our colleague Marius has passed. Marius, of course, was a previous dean of this Faculty of Law, and at the time of his death, he was the chairperson of our Department of Private Law, and it certainly wasn't the first time that he occupied that position. As a scholar, Marius was definitely a leader in his field. He received numerous awards, fellowships, appointments as international visiting professorships, all in recognition of his excellence as a scholar. But Marius was more than a scholar. He was our colleague, he was our friend, and he was a wonderful human being. As a teacher and as a colleague, Marius was always principled. He was collegial, he was supportive, and therefore it's our privilege today to be supportive of the De Waal family and also to have this memorial event. As stated in the faculty's formal announcement, Marius leaves a tremendous void in this faculty, one that will be very difficult to soon forget, and I would venture to say that it will not be possible to fill that void. Of course, we would have preferred not to meet today in this event for purposes of a memorial. But now that Marius has passed, it falls upon us to celebrate and to commemorate his life and legacy. And that is for us no duty, it is a privilege and one that we gladly take up. Because of the person that Marius was, it's possible for us to not think of a life that has ended, but rather to think of another life that has started. Marius will forever be in this Ou Hoof Gebou. His legacy is visible to everybody who take the time to look around them, to pay attention. And this is beautifully captured in a comforting and short poem that I would like to now recite for you. Many of you might know it. It's a poem by Mary Fry. And I want to share it with you because for me it's specifically true with regards to Marius when I look around this building. The title of the poem is "Do Not Stand at My Grave and Weep." I am not there. I do not sleep. I am 1,000 winds that blow. I am the diamond glints on snow. I am the sunlight on ripened grain. I am the gentle autumn rain. Waken in the morning's hush. I am the swift uplifting rush of quiet birds in circled light. I am the soft stars that shine at night. I want to say specifically thank you for all the colleagues. When we reach out to ask whether there's some colleagues that were specifically prepared just a short tribute or reflection on Marius's impact and influence in their lives and also beyond, who immediately responded so positively. Thank you for everybody who is here today who will make a short contribution. But I also want to encourage you to participate from the floor. We will have an opportunity for tributes from all of the attendings, time allowing, And then finally, time allowing, we would really love to give an opportunity for some people who have been or who will be attending virtually. So time allowing, we'll also try to do that. I want to just remind you that you can also, if you're at home, if you're not with us today, you are welcome to also send a message. Yes, so everybody who is attending virtually, please take the opportunity to also send your wishes and reflections in the chat box. We will compile an extract of that for record purposes, and we will also make the recording available for those who cannot attend today. So on that note, I want to invite Professor Cornie van der Merwe, first of all, to start off. He will start, and thereafter the next speakers will join on the platform. We won't introduce the individual speakers. They will just come up and deliver their tribute. And thereafter, I will return and we'll start with tributes from the floor. So from my side, thank you for attending this event. Thank you for making this special event in honor of Marius. And I trust that you might be able to join us afterwards as well, when we have an opportunity to have some social interaction, even if it is physically distanced. And we invite all of you to that short intermingling. So, Cornie?
My eerste ontmoeting met Marius De Waal was toe hy in 1974, net voor die aanvang van sy BCom regte studies, my kantoor binnengestap het en met daardie effense brei in sy stem my gevra het. Professor, nie een van my familie is in die regsberoep nie. Vertel my asseblief, hoe moet mens studeer as jy regte studeer? Ek weet nie meer wat ek vir hom gesê het nie, maar van daardie tydstip af was hy een van die beste regstudente wat ek ooit gehad het. Eers was hy my studenteassistent wat daardeur gewerk het om al die voetnote in my boek oor sakereg versigtig deur te gaan. Daarna het Marius sy LLM oor die mandament van spolie met onderskeiding verwerk. Die teses het gehandel oor die besitsersstaat van plakkershutte wat onregmatig van grondstukke verwyder is. Sy verhandeling is later in verskeie hofsale aangehaal, onder andere ook met instemming deur regter Edwin Cameron in 'n uitspraak van die konstitusionele hof. Daarna het hy vir 3 jaar gewerk aan 'n LLD-verhandeling oor die geldigheidsvereistes vir grondservitute. In die proefskrif het hy onder andere verwys na die servituut van Balhal, fetching the ball, ten gunste van die buurerf langs die Matie rugbyveld. Hierdie servituut het die Matie rugbyspelers verplig om rugbyballe wat hulle oor die grens geskop het, te gaan haal. Hy het duidelik daarop gewys dat hierdie servituut verkeerd geregistreer is, want jy mag nie 'n positiewe plig plaas op die eienaars van die buurerf nie, soos wat jy almal weet. Toe ek aan die einde van die 3 jaar sy verhandeling goedkeur en hom vra om dit vir eksaminering in te dien, het hy gesê, gee my net 'n kans om dit nog eenmaal deeglik deur te werk. 'n onverbeterlike verhandeling is toe 3 maande later formeel ingedien. Professor André van der Walt, wat later die bekende werk oor servituutreg geskryf het, was vol lof oor die uitnemendheid van die verhandeling. As akademikus het Marius diep spore getrap. Hy was reeds op jeugtige ouderdom 'n professor aan die Randse Afrikaanse Universiteit. Daarna was hy vir jare lank regsprofessor aan die universiteit, onder andere as dekaan en verskeie kere as voorsitter van die departement privaatreg. Hy het talle tydskrifartikels, hoofstukke en boeke oor die vakgebiede sakereg, deliktereg, erfreg en trustreg gepubliseer. Hy het ook internasionale beroemdheid verwerf met sy besoeke aan die Skotse universiteite van Aberdeen en Edinburgh, die Max Planck Instituut in Hamburg, die Belgische Universiteite Leuven en Maastricht en die Franse Paris 5 Universiteit, waar hy elke jaar lesings gegee het oor South Africa as a mixed legal jurisdiction comprising English common law and Romanistic civil law. Marius was 'n begaafde en simpatieke dosent. Hy het besonder moeite gedoen om ingewikkelde hofsaake en regsprobleme op 'n glashelder manier aan studente te verduidelik. Maar ek wil vandag liewer oor Marius as mens praat. Ek was altyd verbaas hoe netjies sy lesenaar was en oor die warmte waarmee hy jou in sy kantoor begroet en na jou welstand verneem het. Hy was bekend vir sy buitengewone integriteit en nederigheid. Hy was in vele opsigte 'n rolmodel vir sy studente en kollegas met sy waardige optrede, sy oorwoë standpunte, sy gewilligheid om te luister, sy bereidheid tot onbaatsigtige diens en sy onkreukbare lojaliteit teenoor die universiteit en die Regsfakulteit. Professor Rodley Paisley of the University of Aberdeen had the following to say about Marius. Marius was one of the most decent men I ever met, a very good scholar, but more importantly, a true friend. I still laugh about that time you brought him to our house for a light tea. Toe Professor Paisley vir Marius gevra het hoe hy hom op 'n Sondagmiddag by hulle huis in Aberdeen kon onthaal, het Marius in sy geskiedenis gevra vir net 'n koppie tee. Min wetende dat tee laatmiddag in Skotland 'n volledige maaltyd beteken. Roddy se vrou was nie die betrokke dag by die huis nie en Roddy moes toe rondskarrel om vir Marius sy tee voor te berei. Professor Chen Lei, formerly Vice Dean of the City University of Hong Kong and now Professor in Chinese Law at the University of Durham in the United Kingdom, and the first Chinese student that obtained an LLD degree from the University of Stellenbosch, wrote the following in an email. Just saw the very sad news that Professor Marius De Waal has passed away at such a young age. I was shocked when I heard the news. He will be sorely missed. He was very kind to me when I first arrived at Stellenbosch in 2005. This is a huge loss to Stellenbosch Law Faculty and surely the field of comparative private law internationally. Please pass on my condolences to his family. Dirk Erdelkamp, an assistant of Professor Reinhard Zimmermann in Hamburg and a former LLM student of the University of Stellenbosch, had the following to say. The sad news about Marius reached me last night. I've gotten to know Marius as an incredibly warm-hearted, attentive, gentle, and open-minded person. I shall miss the cordiality with which he welcomed me on all my visits to Stellenbosch. His humor, his interest in my academic development. I still hear his voice very clearly in my head and cannot believe he is gone. It is comforting that with Andreas Hume and Professor Zimmermann, there are people here in Hamburg who knew Marius well, so that we are not alone in our grief. Dan wil ek ook net met u deel wat Marius Jr. vir my gesê het na sy toespraak tydens die gedenkdiens in die moederkerk. Hy was so 'n fantastiese vader vir my en vir Greta. Ek het net mooie herinneringe van hom. hoe kon ek anders as om net goeie dinge oor hom te sê? He was such a fantastic father for me and Greta. I only have fond memories of him. I could say only good things of him. There is a Latin maxim which reads as follows: Ubi felix sum. Almal van u is regsstudente, u weet ubi beteken where, sum I am, Felix is happy. Felix is Felix the cat. Where I am happy, ibi there, patria is. There is my fatherland. Now Marius was happy at the University of Johannesburg, the University of Aberdeen and Edinburgh in Scotland, the Max Planck Institute in Hamburg, the Belgian universities of Leuven and Maastricht, and Paris 5 in France. But his special love and affection remained for Stellenbosch, his beautiful house on Lanzarote Road 13, with his wife Elmarie and their children, Marius and Greta. The University of Stellenbosch, the law faculty, in the Ou Hoof Gebou, which he served with unfailing loyalty for the most of his life. I want to conclude with the words of the Roman poet Catullus to his late brother, Atque in perpetuum frater ave et vale, and forever my beloved friend Marius, hail and farewell. May you be blessed in the house of your Heavenly Father. Mag jy gelukkig wees in die huis van jou Hemelse Vader.
Good afternoon, colleagues, friends, Elmarie, lede van Marius gesin en familie. Ek gaan my huldeblyk ter wille van die gehoor in Engels doen, maar ek doen dit tog met die wete dat Marius my passie vir Afrikaans gedeel het. For those of you who may not know me, I am Francois de Tooy. I am a professor at the University of the Western Cape's private law department, but I'm a long-standing colleague of Marius, and I'm going to expand on my relationship with him in my short reflection. I'm particularly privileged to have known Marius in a variety of capacities. I first encountered him when I was a second-year law student here at Stellenbosch University in the mid-1980s. Marius was my lecturer in succession law, and although he was still a relatively young lecturer at the time, I recall distinctly the clarity and typically Marius the precision with which he presented his lectures. He displayed an impressive mastery of the subject matter of the discipline, and he very quickly became one of our class group's very favorite lecturers. He was certainly far less intimidating than Professor Corny van der Merwe, particularly in those besprekingsklasse that we used to have in the second year. As we know, Marius left Stellenbosch a couple of years later for Johannesburg to join the Randse Afrikaanse Universiteit, and I next met up with him upon his return to Stellenbosch when I was doing my LLM studies. And I was appointed as a lecturer at the University of the Western Cape upon the completion of my LLM thesis. And as luck would have it, the two courses that were assigned to me when I joined UWC were succession law and trust law, Marius's two specialist disciplines. I regularly turn to Marius for guidance and for advice during those early years of my academic career. And he was unwavering in the support that he provided, the assistance that he provided to me as a young academic. And Marius quickly assumed the role of a mentor to myself at the start of my academic career. And his mentorship in particular set me on the path to becoming the established academic that I am today. I shall be forever grateful to Marius for his invaluable mentorship to me during those early years of my academic career. I decided to embark on doctoral studies towards the late 1990s, and Marius was an obvious choice as a doctoral supervisor. And to his immense credit, the topic that he proposed for my doctoral studies, namely the impact of the Constitution on freedom of testation in South African law, stands me in good stead to this very day. In fact, just last week, I completed yet another article on this topic. His vision regarding the longevity of this topic is simply astounding. His supervision of my doctoral dissertation was impressive. It was firm, yet he allowed me enough room to explore some of my own ideas. It was accommodating, yet he quickly reined me in when I was about to go off on some tangent. And I learned so much from Marius regarding supervision during those times. And much of what I learned, I still apply in respect of my own supervision of postgraduate students today. As my academic career progressed, Marius and I became close colleagues and good friends. I could call on him at a moment's notice for advice, for assistance in academic and non-academic matters. And he was unfailing in the support he provided to me. As an aside, we had in-depth discussions on the purchase of a new vehicle. And had it not been for him, I would not be the proud owner of a Toyota Fortuner today. Marius was without a shadow of a doubt the single person that had the greatest impact on my academic career. And for that, I honor him today. How shall I remember Marius? I have a good friend and colleague at the Melbourne Law School in Australia, Matthew Harding. Marius and Matthew met just once at a conference I organized a couple of years ago at UWC. And when I informed Matthew of Marius's passing, he sent me a WhatsApp message in which he recalled this meeting that he had with Marius, the single meeting at this conference. And in the WhatsApp message, he wrote, referring to Marius, "He struck me as a learned man and a gentleman." And that from just one meeting. And that is indeed how I shall remember Marius. He was extremely knowledgeable in academic matters and non-academic matters. But beyond that, he was a wise man. And as we all know, there's a very important and vital distinction between knowledge and wisdom. Marius was knowledgeable and he was wise. And his wisdom came to the fore pertinently in the manner in which he engaged with others, whether they were colleagues, friends, students, strangers. His interactions with others were always respectful, always with humility, always constructive, never destructive. How shall I remember my friend and my colleague, Marius De Waal? I shall remember him as a learned man and as a gentleman. Thank you.
Dear Elmarie and family, colleagues and friends. I have known Marius De Waal for 27 years, since I joined the faculty on 1 April 1994. Before I arrived here in Stellenbosch, I received a telephone call from Marius inquiring as to whether we needed any assistance in finding accommodation or other assistance with our move from Potchefstroom. Once my lecturing duties were clarified, I received a package in the mail containing hard copies of Marius's handwritten notes for Roman law, one of the modules I was to teach here at Stellenbosch. For many years, those handwritten notes formed the backbone of my teaching, expanded on and tweaked over the years. There was no obligation on Marius to extend his hand in assistance before I joined the faculty, yet he kindly did so. I think all of us here today can relate to a similar interaction with Marius. Indeed, I think this sums up Marius perfectly, a kind person, interested in his fellow colleagues and staff members, certainly as members of the Department of Private Law and the Faculty of Law, but more importantly, as individuals and as persons. Marius was a multidimensional, balanced, rounded person, much like a fine-textured, balanced Merlot. Shiraz was just a little bit too sharp. His multidimensionality resonated in his expertise and brilliance, in the law of trusts and of succession, his hard work in the department and faculty, where one could always rely on his presence and support, his dedication to lecturing and students, his commitment to research, and his community work, the latter often under the radar. He was not someone for the limelight, but if he had to, he would handle it with grace and humility. Over and above all of these qualities was his personal interaction with colleagues and students, as a soundboard, a guide, a mentor, and a friend. He was a role model and inspiration in the big things, like his NRF rating and his Chancellor's Award, but also in the smaller things, like his neat and organized desk and office. On a lighter note for me personally, the latter was rather interesting. My first office was the one that Tala now occupies. A few years after my appointment, I relocated to my current corner office. Marius used to phone before he popped into one's office just to make sure the time was convenient. He did so one afternoon in his capacity as head of the department, about a year after I relocated to my current office. After alerting me of his visit, I moved a few things around on my desk to make it appear more tidy and more organized. He knocked, always very polite, looked past the office door and said, "Juanita, trek jy alweer?" I said, "Nee Marius, dit is maar hoe my kantoor lyk." "Juanita, are you moving again?" "No Marius, this is what my office looked like." So I had to smile. For many years, we lectured law of things and law of succession in tandem, while the modules were still linked credit-wise. Long before internal moderation was the official policy in the faculty, Marius guided me in doing exactly that, considering the marks of each and every student, using rulers and moving along the mark sheets, individually scrutinizing each student's performance. Where there were discrepancies between predicates and exam marks, we scrutinized the examination scripts to find out what went wrong. I still do it exactly like that. I learned a lot from Marius about processes, checks, and balances. His institutional memory was unsurpassed. He was the go-to person concerning program and assessment concerns. One would first consult Marius for a precise answer, instead of trying to figure out what the yearbook provides for. As head of department, he led by example, by his research contributions, as well as his exceptional student evaluations. Before dealing with the formal part of performance appraisal, he would inquire about the family, whether everyone is doing fine, about your health and your general disposition. This year's performance appraisals were on Microsoft Teams, the technical site organised by Jasnine. When my time appeared on the slot and I could not join the link, I contacted Jasnine to find out what's happening. The schedule fell behind because of Marius first finding out how everyone is doing. Needless to say, we also exceeded my allocated time slot. While his legacy lives on in the old main building, as we aspire to treat each other like he would have done, with respect and kindness, in how we approach our students, prepare for our lectures, and attend to our daily duties, we are grappling with our loss. I think we are starting to consider on an abstract, theoretical level what his untimely death means for the department and the faculty. But in reality, we will only realize the full impact going forward. Indeed, we can and we have to conceptualize and plan and construct, but the gap will remain. Someone else will now have to attend all of the faculty functions. Each and every law dance, final year's dance, inaugural lecture, public lecture, graduation ceremony, research discussion, Senate meeting, departmental meeting, and JV function. And even if we do find such a person somewhere, or appoint such a person in future, it will not be the same, because there was only one Marius De Waal, and we will miss him. Thank you.
Marius was my oldest South African friend, the very first legal academic from South Africa whom I met. He was also one of the most important. Perhaps it's worth recounting the circumstances of our very first meeting. Marius was on research leave at the University of Regensburg as a guest of Reinhard Zimmermann. This was in the autumn of 1994. With the assistance of Reinhard, I invited Marius to come and visit us in Edinburgh. I can still remember going out to the airport to pick him up, having no idea at all what he looked like. I carried a large sign with me saying, Professor De Waal. It was only when I got to know him better later on that I realised that with his keen interest in cars, he must have been horrified by the disreputable vehicle that I was driving. But if so, he was, as ever, too polite to pass comment. And Marius's visit was the beginning of a warm and productive friendship between us, which lasted for almost 30 years. After that first visit, Marius returned to Edinburgh on a number of occasions, I would guess about half a dozen. Usually he gave an academic paper or co-taught a class with me. In these ways, and also in others, he became well known to the private lawyers at Edinburgh University and other Scottish universities as well. Not everyone amongst his South African colleagues, particularly his younger ones, will know that Marius also contributed in a significant way to the legal literature of Scotland. Early on in our friendship, Marius was one of a small and distinguished group of South Africans who were persuaded, though that's not perhaps the right word, persuaded by Reinhard Zimmermann and me to write for a book known informally as Northern Cross, but more properly as A History of Private Law in Scotland. Marius's topic was on the law of servitudes, and his chapter on that subject remains even today a primary point of research reference. Later on, he also took part in another project organised by Reinhard and me, and also with Danny Visser, which tried to compare the private law of Scotland and South Africa, mixed legal systems in comparative perspective. Marius, again, being an important contributor, an important part of that team. Since his death, many of my colleagues in Scotland have said to me how saddened they are by his departure. I know that I speak for all of them, and some are listening at the moment, when I say that Marius was an important figure in our lives and a true friend of Scotland and of Scots law. At this point, I could go on and say something about Marius the scholar, but I think that's better left to another occasion, and instead I want to say just a little about Marius the person. Much, of course, here could be said and will be said by others, and I just want to single out three aspects, three of his many fine qualities. First of all, Marius was wonderful, really wonderful, to work with. Over the last 15 years or so, Marius, Reinhardt and I have collaborated closely in the field of comparative succession law. 4 edited volumes have been published so far, and the very last time I spoke to Marius at the end of February was as part of the planning for Volume 5. Efficient, good-humoured, emollient, Marius was the perfect person with whom to collaborate. A particular skill was to curb the wilder ideas of his fellow editors. Though less voluble than either Reinhardt or I, Marius generally managed to get his own way. Behind that almost shy smile lay a great deal of determination. Secondly, Marius was an excellent listener, not a quality found in all legal academics. That was one reason, I think, why he was so widely liked. My own children were fond of Marius because he took them seriously enough to ask them questions. To an unusual degree, Marius was able to draw people out. And finally, Marius's taste in music. Something was said about this at the memorial service. Of all composers, he had a particular liking for the keyboard music of Domenico Scarlatti, an unusual choice, but also a characteristic one. Scarlatti's music is orderly, contained, rational, sometimes elegiac, but underneath its elegant surface, also complex and emotional. As we listen to this music now, we can, I think, hear something of the man himself, of our dear friend and colleague, Marius De Waal.
Elmarie, Greta, Marius. Ek is dankbaar vir hierdie geleentheid om my diepe respek vir Marius en my ontzag vir julle verlies te kan uitspreek. Dit sou julle as Marius se naastes miskien nie verbaas het nie, hoeveel mense met geweldige skok en smart sy onverwagse oorlye ervaar het. Ek is een van daardie mense. Elkeen van ons het 'n deel van Marius besit. Ek in ons lang, humorvolle vriendskap en meer belangrik nog, as medeskrywers toe Marius die reuse taak onderneem het om saam met my Honorary South African Law of Trusts te redigeer. Dit was beide 'n vreugde en 'n openbaring om met Marius te kan saamwerk. Vreugde omdat hy sekerlik een van Suid-Afrika se hoflikste, liefste en bedagsaamste medeskrywers was. 'n Openbaring omdat Marius se diepe intelligensie, sy grondige verkenning van die regsbronne en sy uitnemende begrip van regsbeginsels ongeëwenaard was. Professor Smith, I thank you as Dean for giving me this slot in Marius's memorial today. It is my deep regret that a long-standing prior commitment at this hour to a seminar on violence by the Judicial Inspectorate that I now head precludes me joining you live. I share the faculty's and the university's deep shock and grief at Marius's terribly premature death. He was without question one of our country's most deeply intelligent, scholarly, penetrating, observant, rigorous, and productive legal minds. His premature death is a staggering loss, not only to his loved ones here today, Elmarie, Greta, and Marius, but to the many, many friends who deeply treasured him. At Marius's funeral service here in Stellenbosch on the 1st of May, I was struck how vividly and feelingfully many people spoke about him. The rector, Professor De Waal, and others spoke, but most feelingfully, of course, his beloved family, Elmarie, Greta and Marius. After nearly 2 months, Marius's death remains a profound shock. It is also a feelingful loss for Stellenbosch University as a whole, and especially for the law school. To me, Marius was a warm, funny, wry, generous and delightful human being. He was as diffident as he was enormously talented. I treasured my friendship with Marius, and it gave me a special delight when I was able to make him laugh. Our collaboration as co-authors of Honoré brought me great joy, and it taught me a great deal. Trust law was, of course, one of Marius's specialties. When he agreed to join as co-author, it was an enormous gain for the book and for trust law in South Africa. Now, Marius was the author not only of the chapter on trusts in the annual survey of South African law, and of numerous penetrating internationally recognized journal articles. He was also now the main contributing author to our country's standard work in trusts. He brought enormous immaculate expertise and scholarly precision and exactitude to the work. Elmarie, ek wil amper sê dat die woorde immaculate, precision en exactitude met humor natuurlik bygevoeg, asook deernisvolle menslikheid, Marius as mens opsom. We mourn Marius profoundly. I mourn him profoundly, and can only imagine the loss that Elmarie, Greta, and Marius, and others who were even closer to him than I was, must endure. Our consolation, if there is any consolation, is that this huge-spirited, hugely intelligent, and delightfully generous human being has left a profound mark on scholarship, on his circle of friends and family, and on the university. And through his profound impact, his memory and his brilliance live on. Thank you.
Dear family, dear friends, dear colleagues of Marius. Marius was the leading scholar in his field in South Africa and one of the leading ones worldwide. His contribution on succession law and trust law to the Oxford Handbook of Comparative Law is the authoritative statement on the state of art on the subject today. Marius is co-author of what must be considered one of the finest textbooks in South African legal literature, Honoré's South African Law of Trusts. He has been part of innumerable international projects and is the author of seminal articles on property law and the law of succession. Marius was co-founder of the International Study Group on Comparative Succession Law. All of this is well known and does not need to be repeated here in any detail. Marius was an outstanding scholar. But what is not much more important, he was a wonderful person. Our friendship reaches back 43 years. Half a lifetime, one would normally say, but 2/3 of his lifetime for Marius, in view of his premature death. When I was in Stellenbosch for the first time in May 1978, I stayed at Helshoogte residence. There were lots of students keen on rugby playing. But there were also 2 persons interested in literature and music and politics. One of them was Marius. He was 21 years old at that time. We became close friends and have remained close friends ever since. The evening before I left, we went to the opera to see Fidelio, and he gave me, to remind me of my time in Stellenbosch, a book of Afrikaans poetry. Jacques du Plessis and I chose 2 verses that he gave me in addition to that book for our in memoriam in die Bürger when we heard about his death. Little did Marius and I know when we parted how much our lives would happily become intertwined. Over the last few days, I have gone through the correspondence with Marius that has accumulated over 43 years. In the first letter, after my departure in June 78, he wrote, "Skryf maar weer gauw, want ek mis ons lekker geselsies aan tafel." He wrote about life in the army. He commented on German and US American politics. But at least, he wrote, Herr Stoiber is a more exciting personality than the somewhat lackluster Angela Merkel. This was in 2002. He gave advice on cars. Jy kan gerus maar voortgaan om 'n nuwe Volkswagen Golf te koop. And he gave advice on life in general. Moenie die goeie raad vergiet nie, luister na jou liggaam. He reported about his Bible study. When Marius Jr. had just turned 1, he wrote, "Ek moet ongelukkig sê dat hy nog nie die Duitse Bybel lees nie wat jy vir hom gegee het." He also wrote about the little mishaps in his life. How, as a final year student coming back from Pretoria with his sister Connie, he found himself out of petrol 3 miles outside Drie Susters. Ek is so skaam dat ek dit vir niemand wil vertel nie. And he wrote again and again about music. I'm not a great fan of Mahler, but at least his last word before he died was apparently Mozart. Marius came to Regensburg and to Hamburg on many occasions, several times for extended periods. Over the years, we have cooperated in more than 10 international academic projects leading to book publications. That is more than I've done together with any other colleague. I also think that there are few people with whom I've shared more experiences than with Marius. Mountaineering, concerts, academic work, and so much else. Marius always went out of his way to assist others, and he inspired admiration and friendship in those whom he met. Lionel Smith has said as much on behalf of the International Study Group on Succession Law in a message to the family. Just about every member of that group wrote to me after hearing about Marius's death to express their grief and sense of loss. Marius was a pillar of support during my years at the University of Cape Town, and he was like a second son to my parents during the first year he spent in Germany, here at the Max Planck Institute in Hamburg. My mother remembered certain incidents with Marius until the end of her life. She was very fond of him. Only 2 days ago, I met a German doctoral student over lunch on the open market. He had done his LLM in Stellenbosch 2 years ago and had attended Marius's classes and written his thesis under Marius's supervision. And when I asked him how it had been, he said immediately that it was for him the best academic experience in his life. Marius was really concerned about his students. He managed to inspire them and was unfailingly kind and supportive. I have heard many others to say the same thing. Marius came as close as one can come to the ideal of a true scholar, a caring academic teacher, and a loyal and committed colleague. He was a humble person, intellectually and otherwise, with so little to be humble about. Farewell, old friend.
To all the speakers, it is very touching and I think so accurate and descriptive tributes that you've done. What a wonderful opportunity to come together and reflect on Marius in this way. Colleagues, we do have time for people who would like to share a reflection, a memory, a short story, or just a few words with the rest. I want to invite you to come to the front. Because we are broadcasting, it's easier if we use this microphone. And I'm happy to open the floor to give you this opportunity. I know there are some people in the room who are very close to Marius, and if you feel up to it, we would like to invite you to come and share some of your thoughts with us. Dr. Isel Du Plessis.
Thank you. In our faculty, Marius De Waal was known as the reasonable man. Often when one would speak to someone who had some connection with the faculty about Marius, say a former student or colleague from another university, he or she would quip and say, "Oh yes, the reasonable man," and we would share a smile. Because you see, the reasonable man is the standard against which we measure actions. We use this fictional character to judge whether a particular action was the right thing to do in the circumstances, or whether someone was perhaps negligent. I first met this fictional, reasonable man in my third year as a student at this faculty, in the module on the law of delict, taught by none other than Marius De Waal himself. I stand to be corrected, but I suspect that that was the only year in which Marius De Waal drew the short straw and had to stand in for Professor Max Loebscher for one semester to teach delict. The more I learned about this fictional, reasonable man, the more I disliked him. And by the way, in those days, it was always a reasonable man, never a reasonable woman. You see, the reasonable man always knew exactly what to do. And in my mind, he became a sort of caricature. He was old, or at least he had grey hair, which in my student days immediately signaled a person to be ancient. I have since changed my views, by the way. But he was old. He sat alone in an old armchair and probably in an attic somewhere where he was insulated from the rest of the world. From there, he would observe us who lived in the real world, and tell us where we'd gone wrong or made a mistake. He was a know-it-all, haughty type of fellow with no sense of humor, no emotions, and no one to love or who could love him back. But this caricature of the reasonable man is so unlike what Marius De Waal was like. Of course, Marius was reasonable. He knew what the right thing was to do, and he led by example by actually doing the right thing. In that sense, I suppose, he was like the reasonable man, but in so many other respects, he was completely the opposite of my caricature of the reasonable man. Marius was not old. He never looked his age. And he had the energy and enthusiasm of a young man. He worked incredibly hard, yet he never seemed tired or worn out, and he always had time, whether it was for a quick chat or for a longer appointment. Marius also had a wonderful sense of humor. He could say just the right thing at the right time and have everyone in stitches. He could also say the right thing to calm everyone down, to quiet down the sometimes choppy waters of faculty board meetings. Although he was brilliant and had achieved so much in his career, he was never proud or arrogant about it. He remained humble. More importantly, he was never condescending towards any of us who were not as bright or talented as he was. As Marius's doctoral student, I learned that, like the excellent teacher that Marius was, he would wait patiently for me to discover for myself what he had already learned and understood so long ago. But he would always encourage and motivate and ultimately inspire me to be better than I ever thought I could be. What a privilege I had to have him as my promoter. He was also my mentor and friend, the one with the solid advice, the guy who could tell the wood from the trees, but more importantly, the one I knew would be in my corner, cheering me on, willing me to succeed, someone who believed in me. Lastly, Marius loved his family, and he was loved. Although he was a private person, a story about his family would often slip into the conversation, whether it was about Elmarie, of whom he was so very proud, or about Marius Jr. Yes, we heard about his matric breakaway at Keerbooms, or about Greta. He was so pleased about your doctorate, and I'm so happy for you that you got to share that with your dad. And so we know that he was loved and that he loved you. Marius was also loved in this faculty by his students and by us as his colleagues. Thank you, Elmarie and children, and the rest of the family, for sharing your brilliant and, in my view, unreasonable husband and father with us.
Colleagues, I think what I'm going to do then, if we exclude anybody, I apologize, but this is a little bit difficult to navigate all the different panels. I'm going to invite our colleague from private law, Professor Jacques du Plessis, perhaps just to formally conclude our proceedings. And Jacques, if you come up, then I think we can conclude the formal part of the event. Thank you.
I would like to convey my appreciation to the Dean for the opportunity to say a few concluding words at this sad but also celebratory occasion. I would first like to express a few words of thanks. As Marius's one sister said in her moving address at his funeral service, beware of a woman with a list. Well, pas op vir 'n vrou met 'n lys. But a man with a list should not be underestimated either. And on my list, I would first like to thank all the speakers today who so kindly and courageously shared their appreciation of a person who meant so much to them and to us all. Your tasks were not easy, for Marius was very close to you, and his loss was so sudden, but you vividly recreated him in our minds, and you reminded us why he was so dear to our hearts. Tweedens is 'n woord van dank verskuldig aan almal wat vandag se herdenkingsgeleentheid ondersteun en moontlik gemaak het. Aan Elmarie en die familie wat sulke ongelooflike krag en standvastigheid in hierdie moeilike tye openbaar het. En aan vandag se gebeure hul seën gebied het. En dan ook aan die dekaan en haar personeel wat gehelp het met die opstel van die program, die uitnodigings, tegniese reëlings, nie onaansienlik nie, asook die byeenkoms hierna. Thirdly, a word of thanks goes to all here in person, as well as those of you who are present virtually. Many of you have in various ways, through messages, through posts, and even through words of poetry, expressed your sadness, but also your deep appreciation for all that Marius meant to you in your lives. We are glad that you could be part of today's event, and in this way not only support us all in coming to terms with the terrible loss, but also join us in expressing gratitude for the gift that was Marius. To conclude means to bring to an end, but also to sometimes express an evaluation after some consideration. Afsluiting verg dat 'n lyn getrek word, maar ook 'n waarderende terugskouing. What can one say today in conclusion about Marius? The previous speakers have highlighted so many facets of him. I would just like to tell one story that to me sums up so much of him. As Juanita mentioned in the tribute, we have this thing called performance evaluation. At the end of each year, when we as staff members feel that we have given all that we possibly can in the key performance areas of conducting research, teaching, administration, and community service, our university, somewhat clinically, in terms of a system of so-called performance evaluation, prestasie evaluering, expects of us not only to say what we did, but also to give ourselves a mark out of 5, where 3 is just doing the minimum, 4 is good, and 5 is unattainable. Even worse, these self-evaluations have to be discussed with your head of department. Well, a few years ago, when I was head of Department of Private Law, I had the unenviable task of conducting these performance evaluation interviews, including one with Marius. A task that I found rather awkward, given that he was my lecturer from my first year of my legal studies. In fact, the first time I met him was in this very lecture theatre, where he stood exactly where I'm standing now. And I sat in the back, blissfully unaware of how our paths would cross right up to the end. I suppose that you can guess what happened during our performance evaluation discussion. Marius gave himself low scores for each and every one of the performance evaluation categories, mostly just barely above a 3. To some, this might sound strange, for we all know how extraordinary his achievements really were. But my impression was that Marius really felt that in terms of a proper, perhaps somewhat literal interpretation of the wording of the performance criteria, he deserved no more. So to me fell the unfortunate task of explaining to him that on a more expansive interpretation, his performance was actually quite excellent. Marius would accept these explanations only reluctantly. But in the end, we would settle on some amicable compromise. I do hope that Marius took this lesson to heart, and that when he and St. Peter met at the pearly gates of heaven, and he may have been asked to account for himself, he did not once again give himself a too low mark, thereby ending up in the wrong place. Ultimately, what really mattered to Marius was not formal accolades or admiration. What really mattered to him was just to be principled and to be a kind person. May we honor him by expressing these values in our lives. Thank you.
Colleagues, on that note, I think we can all go and talk about our colleague a little bit more downstairs over a cup of tea. I invite you to join us downstairs. Thank you very much.